Let's take a look at war on a truly apocalyptic scale within 40k today. Games Workshop has shown off the fairly obscene stats of 5 factions Titans, so let's see what these god machines and mega transports can do on the board. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're taking a look at the faction focus for the great big Titans in Warhammer 40k. Kind of fun that Games Workshop decided to round out their little series with a look at some of these god machines. Massive, great big impractical models at least most of the time, but really quite fun to see some obscene numbers of and what they might do in game. In the preview we've got some basic rules for fielding the actual Adeptus Titanicus units in Warhammer 40k, plus a little bit as to how the rules of these will be delivered, and then we've got the Eldar Phantom Titan, or Gargantuan Squiggoth, the Tyrannid Hierophant, and the Town Manta. Most of them are pretty interesting in their own way, though I feel like the Town Manta is perhaps particularly so. It actually showcases a whole bunch of new weapons plus flyer rules in Warhammer 40k in general. We hadn't seen any data sheets for flyers before now. In any case, let's jump into it and see what we've got. So first up, for the big fancy resin Titans, it looks like the rules for them will be found in each faction's Imperial Armor Compendium. Rather than a book that you purchase now, it looks like it's going to be free to download for each faction, not too long after the maiden index drops, but it did sound like they'll be coming a little bit later than them, and it does sound like a fair few things are going to Forge World Legends, a lot of things that are out of production, plus unfortunately, as we talked about in the Horus Heresy video the other day, things like the Greater Brass Scorpion, maybe not great news for the Chaos Titan lovers out there. There's nothing to indicate that the rest of these are going to Legends, at least so far though. I'd guess that they'll still wind up being part of mainstream 40k, though I'd say that probably like previous, they'll probably have some fairly obscene points costs that'll realistically keep them out of most competitive type games, and more just in the realm of massive great big fun models for more casual games. It is pretty cool when you have a massive game with a ridiculous amount of forces on each side of the board, and someone brings one or two of these guys along. For the actual Adeptus Titanicus units, so things like the Warhound or the Warlord Titan, the way that you field them is to sell a kidney, then pick one up from Forge World, and then to actually add them into your standard Warhammer 40k force, you field them with this Titanic support special rule. Basically like the Allied Knight, say if you had an army of Space Marines or something, you can add in just literally one Titan unit, even if it doesn't have the faction keyword as the rest of your army. The rules are the same for the Imperial ones and the Chaos ones. They are basically just the same data sheets, but there's a rule here to swap out the Imperium keyword for the Chaos keyword. So presuming you are playing really quite a big game of 40k, you can take a whole chunk of your points in one of these god machines. These rules don't seem to apply to the Xenos armies, looks like they just generally get to be data sheets within their codex, so I guess you'd be able to field as many as you wanted. Realistically, that's probably not going to be many though, unless you're playing at a ridiculously high points level. Obviously that's just a guide. In bigger, more casual games, I'd say that you don't really need to worry about this rule too much. I'm sure people will just be bringing along what they have, if people just want to put some ridiculous war machines on the board in an apocalypse style game. Let's take a look at the actual stats for the Titans themselves though, and kicking off we've got no less than the Warlord Titan itself. Currently I think the most expensive model that Games Workshop sells, around about £1,600 or $2,400 I believe, once they've included the arms and top guns. Currently this guy is a cool 5,500 points in 9th edition 40k, and as you'd expect it's got some absolutely ridiculous stats. A nice 100 wounds at a big toughness 16, a 2+ save and a 5+ invul against range, kind of similar to what the Knights have. I guess that's the new rule for Void Shields in this new version. They're no longer individual shields that you collapse one by one. I feel like the ruling for those was kind of fluffy, though maybe just a little bit fiddly. Seems they've just gone with the simplicity of reducing it down to a standard invul save now, rather than tanky shields that you can regenerate. Then other interesting things on his datasheet is that he has that super heavy walker rule that we still don't know yet, I believe. I think that's going to be one that's listed in the Knights index unless anyone else has seen it elsewhere. I'd guess it'll be the one for stepping over enemy models and things, or potentially some sort of combination of fallback, shoot and charge. Otherwise it's kind of interesting that he costs 4 times the command point cost per stratagem that you use on him, so any command point rerolls are going to have to be a big deal. Still though, I guess even a command point reroll could be a massive deal if he's striking with that power claw, which seems to have a cool 24 damage, so he could be pretty much one-rounding a knight if you reroll that with a CP. Otherwise it looks like his main datasheet rule is called Wrath of the Omnissiah, which means that in the shooting phase, after you've lain waste to your opponent's army with these guns, one unit hit by it takes a battle shock test. That does feel kind of cute in the context of these ridiculous guns. I like the way it just makes one unit just think about what they're doing and trying to take one of these guys on. The weapon stats kind of speak for themselves here. On the top guns you could have the Apocalypse Launcher, which is a 20-shot barrage weapon at damage 2. There's some options for some defensive las cannons and mortars for a bit of point defense. The Volcano Cannon is a primary gun which has got damage 18, D3 plus 3 shots at strength 32, so it'd even wound other Warlord Titans on a 2+ there, and AP minus 5. I think the laser blasters are more top-mounted guns, 6 shots at strength 16, AP 4 and damage D6 plus 3. It's got a macro Gatling blaster, which just cuts through heavy infantry no questions asked, 30 shots hitting on a 3 at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3, a pretty good chance of destroying an entire Terminator squad with that. An enormous Mori Quake cannon that gets to ignore cover and you get 3d6 shots at strength 16, AP 4 and damage 6. And then another one of its primary weapons, you can see it modelled on this one, a Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator, 2d6 plus 6 shots at strength 12, AP 3 and damage 8. Again, that's going to be pretty general purpose, no lay waste to whatever you target. Finally, I do find the melee weapon Power Claw to be pretty hilarious. 6 attacks only hitting on a 4, but any of them that do hit you hit at strength 20, AP 4 and damage 24 there. I believe on average he should be killing 2 Questoris Knights if he gets into combat with them with that. I guess you'd kind of hope so for a model that's about the biggest in the game. Obviously truly ridiculous stats here, it is kind of fun to see the absolute upper limit of 40k war gear. Otherwise, for the Eldar, we've got the Phantom Titan. This guy's currently 3,000 points in 9th edition, and from Forge World it clocks in at £600 or $950. In terms of weight class, he looks like it adds up to around about half a Warlord Titan, 55 wounds at toughness 14 with a save 2+, but a 4+ invul at range this time. That does make him pretty survivable against anti-tank damage, I guess. And he does have a couple of similar rules. The stratagems cost 3 times the command point cost for this one. He has fallback, shoot and charge, and he also gets to move over in models and terrain that's less than 4 inches. I'd say the Phantom Pulsars look like perhaps the most interesting weapon profile out of them. 120 inch range with 8 shots, hitting on a 3+, strength 18, AP 4 and damage 6. Pretty mighty anti-tank duties there. You'd have a pretty decent chance of just one of those laying waste to something like a Space Marine Land Raider in a single shot, or maybe combine them and you'd have a pretty reasonable chance of downing a knight. If you take the Titanic Wraithglaive for him, then he gets 3 attacks hitting on a 3+ at strength 18 and a massive damage 12. Again, pretty much going to obliterate most super heavies he touches there. Next up, we've got the great big bug super heavy in the Tyranid Hierophant. If Games Workshop's teasers do turn out to be accurate, we may well have a new one in that upcoming Norn emissary apparently, but it seems that the old guard Hierophant Bio Titan isn't going anywhere either. Currently this one's 850 points in 9th edition, around about £300 or $500, maybe a little bit cheaper than some on the super heavy range, but it isn't quite the same sort of size as things like a Warlord Titan. As a result, it does wind up a bit more of the actual sort of level that you might field it in a game of 40k. There was a run in 9th edition where a few people were using Tyranid Harridans competitively despite a fairly high points cost, so it's maybe not entirely inconceivable that this guy might actually wind up being kind of good at the right sort of points level. Perhaps one of the main issues with the Hierophant though is more that it's just got an absolutely enormous profile with those crazy big legs. It can make it near impossible to move around terrain on crowded tables. On the defense, it's got 30 wounds at a 2+ save and 5+ invul, that one against range and melee this time, and it's also toughness 14. Still looks fairly solidly tougher than your standard Imperial Knight, things like las cannons wounding it on a 5+. Otherwise, for special rules, it's got a +1 to hit versus battle shock things. Not awful, and I guess that could be useful for the turn that you use Shadow in the Warp as well. Plus it's got a rule to allow it to move over models and terrain that's less than 4 inches in height, though that still won't necessarily help it with ruins and things. Weapons-wise, those bio cannons have got a few extra shots. They still hit at strength 10 and damage 3, so I guess that'll mean that they'd be wounding a bunch of vehicles on a 5 now rather than a 3. They still look massively savage against medium infantry. In combat, the melee is still pretty fearsome as well, 8 attacks with strength 20 and damage d6 plus 1. Overall, it's pretty fun, and really quite a cool model with those great big spindly legs. Next up, we've got the Orky Gargantuan Squiggoth, and this one, at least in 9th edition, is by far the most usable in game, I'd say. 420 points for basically a massive great big Orky transport, outcompeted a bit point for point by things like battle wagons just because they're very cheap and very good, but if you absolutely had to field one of these competitively, this one would probably be the way to go right now. It's quite a cool model, though of course still very expensive from Forge World, over £300 or around $500. It does look pretty fun though to basically have what's more or less a melee knight equivalent type orc unit that also acts as a transport that can dump a whole bunch of boys into the enemy army. In terms of defensive stats, this thing seems to be somewhat equivalent to things like a Guard Baneblade perhaps. It's got the same toughness 13, a few more wounds at 30 wounds, but only a 3+ save, not a 2+. It doesn't have an invul save as well, unlike the rest of the things that we've seen out of this preview. In terms of its actual damage, it's definitely far more of a melee beast than it is a ranged beast. It only hits on the Orky 5+, so even if you upgrade it with the super cannon, which gets you 2d6 shots at strength 12 damage 3, it's still not realistically going to be doing very much. Its combat's far more impressive though, 6 attacks hitting on a 3+ at strength 14 and damage 12. That really is pretty massive, and it can trade it out for the sweep attack at damage 3, which should again be giving you a good chance of one-shotting 5-man squads of Terminators. I'd say the transport capacity is pretty much just as interesting though. It can get 20 Orc boys fitting in it, or dropping down to 15 if it takes the super cannon. Kind of annoyingly, it can't take mega armoured orcs or jump pack orcs, so no storm boys I suppose, but weirdly no one says no to Ghazghkull, so somehow he can fit in, taking up the space of 18 models apparently. Looks like it's a pretty big battle boss for things like burner boys to fire out with. It's got the firing deck 20 rule, and these count as guns that are mounted on the Squiggoth in the new edition. I guess that could be kind of interesting for things like tank busters, keeping up a barrage of rockets as it moves up the board. It's also got a rule called Walking Bastion as well, meaning that you don't get the -1 to hit rolls if it's in combat. Pretty cool to be able to fire it and also get that melee profile. You could have a lot of scary orc shooting hiding in here. Obviously, we'd have to see how it weighs up against things like battle wagons and other transports, but again I feel like this is one of the ones that could genuinely be a good orc unit if they gave it a good points cost. Finally, and jumping back into the realm of ludicrously pricey, very expensive Forge World kits, we've got the Tau Manta, but this one does have some really interesting details on it, as I think it's the first flyer datasheet that we've seen in Warhammer 40k. Currently in 9th edition, this thing's 2,000 points and costs around 1,200 points or $1,950. Again, definitely one of Games Workshop's biggest and most expensive and impractical kits. The thing is absolutely enormous. On the defense, it's got 60 wounds with a 2+ save and a 5+ invul both at range and in melee, toughness 14, and it is an aircraft with a hover keyword, so you could either start it on the board or put it in strategic reserve. Perhaps some of the most interesting things for this guy are the aircraft type keywords. Its movement is interestingly listed as a 20-inch plus. I guess that means in hover mode it drops down to a max of 20, but if it's in fly mode it can just literally move as far as it wants. I guess that kind of makes sense for aircraft in Warhammer 40k, they can usually cross the vast majority of the board anyway, so it looks like Games Workshop have just decided to de-restrict them. At least on this datasheet though, it doesn't appear to have any -1 to hit built into it. I was wondering whether flyers might get that, but it doesn't look like there's anything listed here, so maybe that rule's just entirely dead, and you'll be able to hit aircraft just as well as anything else. As before though, the Manta's enormous transport capacity is just absolutely hilarious. Either 200 infantry or tactical drone models, so that does imply that you might well be able to still field drones as a tactical drone squad, so that's kind of good for Tau players who actually wanted to use them as real models somewhere in their army. Plus it can take 4 tanks, either Devilfish, Skyrays or Hammerheads, and 8 smaller sized battlesuits, anything with 9 wounds or less. It is basically a model that can transport an entire army, and I guess being both a flyer and a transport, that's going to be quite good for getting things out of it now. You'd be able to dump a whole load of Tau forces right in the enemy's face if you really went all in on this. Weapons wise, the stats are still very impressive. 2 enormous heavy rail cannons at strength 26 and damage 12 with devastating wounds, scary stuff as normal. It looks like it's got the new profile for the iron cannon here, maybe not too dissimilar from the version that we had on the Hammerhead tank in 8th edition. You still overcharge it for strength 8 and damage 3 attacks, though it is going to be wounding most vehicles on 4s now. The long-barreled burst cannon arrays are pretty funny as well. I think it's got 16 burst cannons if I remember rightly. I'd guess that each one of these burst cannon arrays represents 8 burst cannons all strapped together, firing out at strength 6, AP -1, damage 1. It's also got a good amount of seeker missiles as well, one-shot attacks with strength 14, AP 3 and damage D6 +1. It seems that like quite a lot of the Tau units though the Manta does hit on a 4+, you'd probably want to have coordinated fire patterns on the go, though that would mean focusing fire with it quite a bit I suppose. Overall, some really quite big fun vehicles there. Pretty nice to see how some of the scariest Titanic things will be working in Warhammer 40k 10th. Let me know your thoughts on the profiles down in the comments. For actual usability in game, I think I'd have most hope for the Gargantuan Squiggoth out of any of those, but for the most part Games Workshop do seem to be happy for Forge World units to be niche but not mainstream. I think it would be a bit dumb if the most competitive thing that you could field in 10th edition 40k somehow wound up just being one single Titan and nothing else. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, but I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you're interested in helping support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.